The Ford Story: How Henry Ford Built His First Car with Only $223 Left. June 4th, 1896. 4 o'clock in the morning. A small shed behind a house on Bagley Avenue, Detroit. Henry Ford stands before his creation, a 500-pound contraption of wood, metal, and dreams. He's ready for his first test drive. There's just one problem. The vehicle is too wide to fit through the door. Without hesitation, Ford grabs an axe and tears down the wall of his own workshop. Because when you've barely slept for 2 days building the future, you don't let a door frame stop you. This is the story of how a night engineer with an axe became the man who put America on wheels, and how 7 years later his company would face bankruptcy with only $223.65 in the bank, until a Chicago dentist placed an order that would change everything. Let's rewind to 1891. Henry Ford wasn't a wealthy industrialist. He wasn't even in the car business yet. He was a night engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit, having just left his small lumber business behind. By early 1894, he'd worked his way up to chief engineer. But here's what made this job perfect: the flexible schedule. While Detroit slept, Ford dreamed. And during his off hours, he worked. In the early 1890s, in a tiny workshop at the rear of his home at 58 Bagley Avenue, just a few blocks from the Edison plant, Ford began tinkering. At that time, anyone experimenting with horseless carriages was considered, well, a bit odd. A dreamer, maybe even crazy. But Ford had support. His wife Clara, whom he'd married in 1888, believed in him. So did his friends and colleagues from Edison: David Bell, Jim Bishop, George Cato, and a man nicknamed Spiderhuff. Every visionary needs a team. Ford was building his. Christmas Eve, 1893. The same year Ford's only son, Edsel Bryant Ford, was born. In that small workshop, Ford's first motor sputtered to life. It worked. For the next 2.5 years, Ford experimented with engine designs, learning, failing, improving. But he didn't begin work on his final, larger motor until January 1896. He based his 2-cylinder engine on a Kane Pennington design he found in the January 9th, 1896 issue of American Machinist magazine. But there was a problem. The details were incomplete. Ford had to devise his own ignition system from scratch. His first attempt? Air-cooled. It ran too hot. So Ford improvised, adding water jackets to the cylinders. This is what separates dreamers from builders. When the instructions are incomplete, builders write their own. When the design doesn't work, builders redesign. The vehicle Ford was creating, which he called the Quadricycle, was a masterpiece of resourcefulness. He used whatever materials he could find: angle iron for the frame, a leather belt and chain drive for the transmission, a buggy seat for comfort. Apart from the motor, wheels, axles, and steering tiller, the entire thing was made of wood. Total weight? Just 500 pounds without fuel. It ran on bicycle-sized wheels with pneumatic tires and had that buggy-like seat. The Quadricycle had 2 speeds, 10 and 20 miles per hour, selected by twin drive belts. It had a neutral gear but no reverse. Gear changes were controlled by a clutch lever on the floor to the right of the driver. Final drive was by a single chain, no brakes. But Ford did include one safety feature: a doorbell, as a horn. June 2nd and 3rd, 1896. Ford hardly slept at all. The Quadricycle was almost finished. So close. Finally, in the early morning hours of June 4th, it was ready. Ford rolled it toward the garage door, adrenaline pumping, and that's when he realized the completed Quadricycle was wider than the opening. Most people would have disassembled it, waited for daylight, asked for help. Henry Ford grabbed an axe. He broke out the doorframe and bricks, widening the opening, and rolled the vehicle into the alley. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning on that June morning, James Bishop mounted his bicycle to ride ahead, alerting passing carriages and pedestrians. And Henry Ford, sitting on that buggy seat, started the engine. The 2-cylinder engine producing 4 horsepower roared to life. Ford had two gears at his disposal. First for speeds up to 10 miles per hour, second for up to 20 miles per hour. But remember, no reverse gear, no brakes, just forward. And forward is exactly where he went. Down Detroit's Grand River Avenue, circling around three major thoroughfares, Ford drove the first automobile he ever designed. Top speed? 20 miles per hour. In 1896, that must have felt like flying. The test was a success. The quadricycle worked. Late in 1896, Ford sold it for $200. He immediately spent that money building his second car. The success of that little vehicle gave Ford confidence. This wasn't just a hobby anymore, this could be a business. In 1899, this led to the founding of the Detroit Automobile Company. But here's what they don't put in the highlight reels. Ford's path to success was anything but smooth. 1898. Ford created the Detroit Automobile Company with investors excited about the horseless carriage revolution. 2.5 years later, dissolved. Failed. March 1902. After falling out with financial backers at his second attempt, the Henry Ford Company, Ford walked away with just the rights to his name and $900. 2 failures. 2 companies that trusted him, that believed in his vision, gone. Most people would have given up. Found a stable job, accepted that maybe they weren't meant to be business owners, but remember that moment with the axe in the doorframe? Ford didn't know how to quit. He turned to an acquaintance, a coal dealer named Alexander Y. Malcolmson, to help finance another automobile company. Malcolmson put up the money to start the partnership Ford and Malcolmson, and together they designed a car and began ordering parts. This time would be different. This time, they had a plan. But by February 1903, Ford and Malcolmson had burned through more money than expected. The manufacturing firm of John and Horace Dodge, the brothers who had made parts for them, was demanding payment. They were out of options, out of money, out of time. Malcolmson made a desperate move. He turned to his uncle, John S. Gray, president of the German-American Savings Bank. Malcolmson's pitch was simple: incorporate Ford and Malcolmson to bring in new investors, and he wanted Gray to join the company, thinking Gray's name would attract others. Gray was skeptical, very skeptical. He'd watched Ford fail twice before. But family is family. And maybe, just maybe, third time's the charm. June 16, 1903, approximately 9:30 in the morning, Detroit, Michigan. Henry Ford and 12 investors met to sign the paperwork that would form Ford Motor Company. The documents were notarized and sent to the office of the Michigan Secretary of State for Incorporation. Those papers, dated June 16, 1903, didn't reach the office until the next day. So technically, on June 17, 1903, Ford Motor Company became a legal entity. The company launched in a converted factory with $28,000 in cash from those 12 investors. The most notable? John and Horace Dodge. Yes, those Dodge brothers, who would later found the Dodge Brothers Motor Vehicle Company. Here's the irony. The first president of Ford Motor Company wasn't Henry Ford. It was John S. Gray, the local banker. Gray was chosen specifically to calm investors' fears that Ford would abandon this company the way he'd left the previous 2. The stock ownership was divided precisely. Henry Ford got 255 shares, Alexander Malcolmson got 255 shares, John S. Gray got 105 shares. Then came John W. Anderson with 50 shares, Horace Rackham with 50, Horace E. Dodge with 50, John F. Dodge with 50, Charles T. Bennett with 50, Vernon C. Fry with 50, Albert Strello with 50, James Couzens with 25, and Charles J. Woodall with 10 shares. 12 investors, $28,000, and a dream of building affordable automobiles. In an assembly room measuring 250 by 50 feet, the Mack Avenue plant, a modest rented wood frame building on Detroit's east side, production began that summer. The car they were building was called the Model A. Designed primarily by Ford's assistant C. Harold Wills, it could accommodate 2 people side by side on a bench. It had no top. And it was painted red, the only color offered by the factory. This was it. Ford's third attempt. Everything was riding on this car. The Model A was a massive improvement over the Quadricycle. It came as a two-seater runabout for $800, or the four-seater tonneau model for $900, with an option to add a top. The horizontal mounted flat 2 engine, situated amidships of the car, produced 8 horsepower. It used a planetary transmission with 2 forward speeds and reverse, a Ford signature you'd later see on the Model T. The car weighed 1,240 pounds and could reach a top speed of 28 miles per hour. It had a 72-inch wheelbase. Small details mattered: a 4x4 horizontal core radiator, closed rear end, and 28 by 3-inch wheels. The rear seating body was even detachable. By early July 1903, the first Model A cars were ready. But there was a problem. A big problem. July 11, 1903. Ford Motor Company's cash balance, $223.65. Out of the original $28,000 investment, that's all that remained. $223.65. They had spent almost everything bringing the Model A to production. No sales, no revenue, no customers. Just $223.65 in a factory full of hope. Can you imagine that boardroom conversation? The investors staring at Henry Ford, the man who'd failed twice before, who just burned through 99% of their money? John S. Gray must have been sweating. The Dodge brothers must have been calculating how much they'd lost. And Ford? Ford was waiting for someone, anyone, to believe in the Model A the way he did. July 15, 1903. A telegram arrived from Chicago. A dentist named Ernst Pfennig wanted to order a Model A, the $850 two-cylinder automobile with a tonneau or back seat. Ford Motor Company's first order. Just over a week later, the car was delivered to Dr. Pfennig. July 23, 1903. Ernest Pfennig became the first owner of a Ford Model A. That single sale changed everything. Henry Ford celebrated his 40th birthday on July 30th, 1903. By then, things were looking better. The company was hiring more hourly workers. Orders were coming in from around the country. Dr. Pfennig's order turned out to be the first of many. Within 2 months, Ford Motor Company had sold 215 cars. By the end of its first year, the Mack Avenue plant had turned out some 1,000 vehicles. For the period between July 23rd and September 30th, 1903, just over 2 months, sales of 195 vehicles produced an income of $142,481.72, with net profits of $36,957. Dividends paid amounted to $10,000. Despite Gray's misgivings, despite the skepticism, despite 2 previous failures, Ford Motor Company was immediately profitable. By October 1st, 1903, they'd made almost $37,000 in profit. From $223.65 to $37,000 in profit in less than 3 months. Now let's be honest. Ford advertised the Model A as the most reliable machine in the world. It wasn't. Like all vehicles of that era, it suffered from overheating and slipping transmission bands. It had problems, lots of them. But it worked well enough and it was affordable enough that people kept buying. The Model A continued to evolve. 1904 models were equipped with a larger 10-horsepower engine borrowed from the Model C and were sold as the Model AC. During the 16 months of Model A production in 1903 and 1904, Ford built 1,808 units. Some sources say 1,750 cars. Others say 677 units were made, with only 8 cars still existing today with original Model A features. The exact numbers vary depending on the source, but what's clear is this. The Model A was replaced by the Ford Model C during 1904, with some sales overlap. But here's what those numbers represent. Proof of concept. Validation. Evidence that Henry Ford's vision wasn't crazy. The success of the Model A provided the foundation for everything that came next. Between 1903 and 1908, Ford produced multiple models using letters of the alphabet, each one teaching them something new about manufacturing, about customers, about efficiency. During these early years, the company produced just a few cars a day. Groups of 2 or 3 men worked on each car, assembling it from parts made mostly by supplier companies. First at the Mack Avenue factory, then at the Paquette Avenue plant, Ford's first company-owned factory, they learned. They improved. They prepared. In 1908, Henry Ford introduced the Model T. In its first full year of production, 1909, just over 10,000 Model Ts were built. As demand exploded, the company moved production to the much larger Highland Park plant in 1910. The lessons learned from building the Quadricycle and the Model A eventually revolutionized not just the automobile industry but manufacturing itself, as Ford developed the assembly line production methods that would make cars affordable for millions of Americans. Let's trace this journey one more time, because the details matter. 1896. A 32-year-old night engineer destroys his workshop wall with an axe at 4 o'clock in the morning to test drive a 500-pound wooden vehicle with bicycle wheels and a doorbell for a horn. He sells it for $200. 1899. First business attempt? The Detroit Automobile Company. Failure? 1901. Second attempt? The Henry Ford Company. Walks away with his name and $900. Failure? 1903. Third attempt, Ford Motor Company. By July 11th, down to $223.65 in the bank. July 15th, first sale to a Chicago dentist. October 1st, nearly $37,000 in profit. 1,808 Model A cars built. A company established. A foundation laid. 1908, the Model T changes the world. The quadricycle that started it all? Ford sold it in 1896 for $200. In 1904, when Ford Motor Company was becoming successful, he bought it back for $65. Today, it resides at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, a 500-pound testament to the power of persistence, to the importance of believing in your vision even when everyone else sees failure. Think about the people in this story. Clara Ford, supporting her husband while he tinkered in a shed. James Bishop, riding his bicycle at 4 o'clock in the morning to clear the path. David Bell, Jim Bishop, George Cato, and Spiderhuff, helping Ford when horseless carriages were considered a joke. Alexander Malcolmson, willing to bet on Ford after 2 failures. John S. Gray, putting his reputation on the line. The Dodge brothers, manufacturing parts on faith. And Dr. Ernst Pfennig, a Chicago dentist who probably just wanted a faster way to make house calls, becoming the person who saved Ford Motor Company with an $850 order. From a shed behind a house on Bagley Avenue to one of the most influential automobile companies in history. From $223.65 to billions of dollars. From one quadricycle to millions of vehicles. The story of Ford's first car isn't just about an automobile. It's about what happens when you grab an axe and tear down the walls that stand between you and your dreams. It's about the difference between failing and giving up. Henry Ford failed twice before Ford Motor Company, but he only gave up once on giving up. So here's my question for you. What wall do you need to tear down? What's your version of that moment at 4 o'clock in the morning when the door isn't big enough and you have to decide, do I make this smaller or do I make the opening bigger? If this story inspired you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about the people who built the world we live in, and drop a comment below. Tell me, what's your $223.65 moment? When was the time you almost quit but didn't? Because somewhere out there, someone is in their own shed, working on their own quadricycle, wondering if they should give up. Maybe your comment is the James Bishop on the bicycle they need, the Clara Ford believing in them, the Dr. Pfennig placing that first order. Share this video. Let's remind people that every empire started with someone crazy enough to tear down a wall at 4 o'clock in the morning. Thanks for watching. Now go build something.